What's that in the sky? It's a bird. It's a plane. No, it's a brand new Pedanticast. That's right, here we are for your listening entertainment. The one, the only, the easily replaceable, Teo Soul. I am, of course, here joined by my co-host, Clark Tatum. Say hello, Clark.
My neck scruff is slowly invading my body. One day I will soon be more beard than man.
I look forward to it. So, how you doing, Clark?
I'm getting through. A little tired, but I am ready for this episode for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And this is a subject, a topic, a
Yes.
idea. And notice I said three things here that is close, near, and dear to our hearts. And that is a Cartoon Network original show. Cartoon Network's to date longest running original show, 10 years if I recall. Ed, and Eddy. And just
Is that
jumping
10
right
years
into
an
it.
asterisk?
I think it's 10 years possibly if you count the movie. I'm not sure, of course, but I think it was 10 years since it was debuted versus when it ended.
Fair enough.
So, we're going to jump right into it and say that for me, this is one of my favorite shows, if not my favorite show from my childhood. It is definitely my favorite show that Cartoon Network has ever produced, not counting Adult Swim. And honestly, I can't even think of something that could challenge it. Like, I like the other products, but there's something that was truly unique and interesting about this show, and it just begs to be discussed.
Totes my goats. I loved this show when I was a kid. I was obsessed with it. I would say that there was this one time they were doing a marathon, and my mom had to take me to a doctor's appointment, and I was so angry because I was going to miss the marathon, and because I've been waiting for it because I love the show so much. It really is a very different kind of show, especially for the lineup at the time.
And yet, weirdly enough, it was very long lived, but for some reason, I never really felt like it was getting the same push that some of the other shows got. I do feel this is my own memory, so I could be mistaken, but when I think about what Cartoon Network was really pushing heavily, it was Dexter's Laboratory, Powerpuff Girls, to a lesser extent Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken was very popular, and Ed and Eddy, it was later, but it also always felt kind of in the background of some of the other shows until those shows began ending.
Well, I think to a point is because it is fairly unique, where the other shows have kind of an easier concept to put out there in words. Ed, Ed and Eddy kind of was a little harder to put into words, and so even when you got like Johnny Bravo, like that Elvis impersonation, macho-headed, meathead kind of guy, and then you got Powerpuff Girls, Superpowered Girls, and then boy genius Dexter. Ed and Eddy is harder to put into words, and so I think it's harder to market to people per se.
That's actually something I kind of want to start with. So, for anyone who is not familiar, Ed, Ed and Eddy is a pretty formulaic show. The
Right.
formula that is used is usually that the Eds, those are the three main characters, Ed, Ed and Eddy, are going to they're carrying out a scam, they call it this, a scam to rob the neighborhood kids of their money so that they can go purchase Jawbreakers. And
An
that's the
instant
basic hook.
commentary on capitalism.
Oh, of course. And Ed, Ed and Eddy. Eddy is the greedy one.
Right.
Ed is the friendly but stupid one, and Double D is the even more friendly and very intelligent one. And basically, what we look at is the scams in question, and then the fallout from those scams, usually leading to a different plot.
Oh yeah, and that was the general structure to the episodes, but that it did not rely on that all the time, and sometimes episodes could get really weird.
Well, and what's always been interesting to me is that so ostensibly these characters are not heroic. They're not really
No.
even. They should not be that likable because they are scam artists, and so you're in a way not to over vilify things, but you are rooting for the villain in this case. You're rooting for them to succeed at fraud.
Well, I think it's there's a way to put it in a sense that I always found the concept very endearing because like only one person was really you could quote unquote and say bad, and that was Eddy. And I want to get to that later, and we definitely will talk about that later. But then you got Double D, as you said, was friendly, and Ed, who was friendly, and they were just kind of following along. And so what you have is this concept of losers who are constantly losing, without it being a problem. But I think to a point, a lot of kids connected to that feeling, and so I think there was something there where it not being the hero kind of made it a little bit more relatable for normal people, because it was a show about just normal kids, and it ended up being really good in that sense.
Absolutely, and that, in looking into the Eds in question and the role that they have in the show, it's interesting because, and I'm not going to do a full cast rundown quite yet, but you have the Eds who are lovable losers, then you
Yeah.
have the popular girl, you have the jock, you have the weird kid, you have the little sister and the kid who likes to hang out with the girls, and then you have the strange foreign kid who is a little different than the weird kid. But it
Right.
really does seem like it's a collection, a group, a cast of. It's like the Eds are losers, even though none of these kids stand out as like, oh, they're the popular kids. It's just that they do take this role of as outcasts.
Well, and I think because the setting of the show is, I think, exemplifies that greatly with it being a cul-de-sac, and just the kind of neighborhood feel of knowing everybody, and it's kind of in this one spot, and so it's not really, no one can really have popularity, if that makes sense, with so few people. But it's a, I want to say, it's a neighborhood of personalities, and the Ed boys, as they're commonly referred to, are just one of the personalities. And so, even when you have the jock and the popular girl, they're more of a representation of character than status.
Well, and what I want to kind of bridge into is that I think one of the big strengths of this show is the fact that it had this established cast of
Right.
about 10, maybe a little more characters, and it just worked on developing those cast members in each episode. It was this its own little world, almost like looking inside of a fishbowl or sea monkey colony, that was self-contained, and that everything in there revolved around these kids. And even if they weren't in the episode, you still had a fair grasp of their personalities, of their likes, their dislikes, of what they're likely going to respond to in a given situation.
Right.
And so you do have this case where the Eds and so occupy this little world, and they have this role as basically, like you mentioned, they are losers, for lack of a better word. They are made fun of. They're thought of as weird, but at the same time, you never really get the sense that the Eds don't deserve some of the treatment, because at the same time they are ostensibly stealing from kids, and
Well,
even if they're
they're
very
trying to
nice
trick
about
them
it,
with
they're trying
scams,
to pull off scams. Yes, and
but
so
they keep the cul-de-sac entertaining and adventurous, and they keep it moving. Oddly enough, they're the thing that keeps the cul-de-sac alive in a weird sense.
but it's this fine balance between them being antagonistic to the other kids and friendly to the other kids. You really do get this sense that even when the Eds suffer, you feel sorry that they did not succeed, but at the same time, you don't really feel that bad because they were trying to succeed at something that was not necessarily a good thing.
Right, and I think it comes to a point of politics with kids. Like, I think, in a sense, kids have that where, like, they'll personally know each other, but they have this weird inner politics. And I think it's weird how the show kind of, while being absurd in certain regards, kind of represents that accurately. How kids will interact when they so personally know each other. And like the Eds, they're doing scams, but everybody knows they're doing scams, and so to a point, it's more like, I don't want to say playing along, but like it's more of the event of the day,
Well, they're
and so
accepting of it, yeah.
yeah, and so I think to a point why, because there's been a lot of shows where the person keeps losing, and I don't enjoy it. It's not a lot of fun. It's bitter and cynical. Where like you can only look at the Eds plans and only have good fun with it. It's almost like not even the Eds really take themselves too seriously, and like Eddy might, but for the most part, it's more just an activity, like playing pretend, almost.
I'm gonna go. So what's interesting, also going back to that cul-de-sac though for a second, because what this show reminds me of, I was thinking about this the other day. What animated show does Ed and Eddy remind me the most of? And the answer might surprise you.
Hmm.
What I had a realization was that this is very similar in a lot of ways to The Simpsons. Now, it's a smaller scale. You don't have the big town of Springfield, but what you do have is a case where you have a plot where the characters are doing something and it's not related to the main plot. And then as a result of their actions, it will bridge into and lead into the main plot, which will usually involve some other character from the town or cul-de-sac that develops through the rest of the episode. And so what they rely on is the strength of the core cast to tell the stories rather than the individual plots being that important. Usually, when you think about the show, at least when I do, you don't think about, oh, the plots were gripping and powerful and twisting and turning. It really is this very strong, well-developed cast of characters that make up this cul-de-sac. Much like with The Simpsons, you don't think of a particular episode so much as you very much remember the residents of Springfield.
It's more the plot is more something to get the ball rolling, so you can get to the characters.
Exactly. And that, I think, there's something to be said here, because right away when I say Ed, Ed and Eddy, more than any other show, I can name the entire cast instantly. If you asked me to name all of the villains that ever appeared on Powerpuff Girls, I'm not sure if I could do it. If you asked me to name anyone besides Dexter's family and Mandark, name some of the other characters, I can't do it. But with Ed, Ed and Eddy, you have this very centralized cast what the stories revolve around that does, it just sticks in your head. And it could be the credit to the writing, it could just be that because there is that focus on the individuals, because the episodes do revolve around usually the way the Eds interact with someone in the cul-de-sac to accomplish something. The Eds themselves are the stars, certainly. They're the ones around which everything revolves. But oftentimes their exploits will center around someone else. Someone else will be pulled into the story.
Right. Like, to an example, I remember specifically this episode where Eddy is trying to get revenge on Kevin for, I think, an unexplained grudge that he has, and he spends the whole episode like being angry at Kevin and forcing Double D and Ed to participate and try to get revenge. But it mostly focused around Kevin, and then there's episodes that focus around like Johnny 2x4. Yeah, it seems like they always like pick a cast member for it to focus around, and then they kind of just show how the Ed boys kind of mess with their general life in a weird way. Like they're like spirits of chaos that just kind of enter in and kind of throw everything for this character into shambles before we get to the resolution.
And it's worth mentioning, by the way, that one of the themes in the show is that whatever the Eds are trying to accomplish, they almost never succeed. If they do, it's very much the victory will then be usually taken away, usually in the last 5 minutes of the episode, or even the last 10 seconds.
Right.
And it will be because the cankers interfere, or because it turns out that there's just some twist of fate, but they almost never succeed in their goal. I can think of very few episodes that end with, and then the Eds accomplish their thing, which is interesting way to take a cartoon. It's almost pessimistic in a way.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it seem like Ed and Eddy is some insane commentary on society, but there are, I think, points where the creators or the writers are actually trying to oddly say something, or if anything, kind of note on an observation. And it, like I joked, like Ed and Eddy is kind of a commentary on capitalism, but it kind of is. It's kind of a joke on capitalism. And so these subjects will pop up, and in a very weirdly pessimistic way, or in a very existential way, where even the episodes where you say, like, the very few episodes where they kind of succeed, it's a very bittersweet. They don't succeed all the way. It's kind of a compromise kind of thing. They never, and definitely Eddy never succeeds. But there's these weird existential bits or commentary bits where it's like it's just kids, but they almost reflect adult life and from almost a pessimistic view, like looking down on kids, if that makes sense.
On a related note, speaking of the creators, I don't know if you remember this, but there are a lot of fourth wall breaks in this show. There are
Oh
a
yeah.
lot. And
Especially near the later seasons, they definitely break that. But yeah, it's littered through all of the show.
they'll say things like, I'm looking for Kevin, but Kevin's not in this episode.
Yeah. I remember
Or,
one.
I'd swear, but Sanders won't let me.
Oh, and there's one episode like they mentioned a previous episode, and it's like, didn't we get nominated for an Emmy? And Double D says hardly or something. And I actually looked it up. They did once in a while get nominated for awards for their backing tracks or their soundtracks or something like that. And so that's a lot of fun to hear.
Absolutely, and I will say beyond that, that fourth wall breaking is interesting because when that's a dangerous fire to play with, to mix my metaphors, because you can very much have the show become self-aware and in a bad way, because I've seen shows that are like, oh, look at how edgy we are, we're breaking the fourth wall. um,
Becomes a crutch.
in a way, Deadpool movies, I think, have kind of started to rely on this a bit much. Not to say they're bad, I do notice there's a lot of that in there, but again, when I think of Ed and Eddy, I don't think of them as snarky commentators, even though there was a lot of snark in there. And it's interesting that that's not what sticks in your head. Whenever I think of this show, the cast, the designs, everything about that stands out. The plot stands out. Sorry, not the plot stand out like in the sense that I remember the specific episode, but I remember that structure, that they're always doing this, they're always doing that. Rolf has his goats, the pigs and the animals. I can remember their names. It is Wilfred, and I shouldn't have said that because I forgot. Victor. Wilfred and Victor.
Yep.
Wanted to say Wilbur, but I was like, no way, Wilbur is the one from Mr. Ed.
Right.
So, but
Wilbur.
I kind of want to move on now. So, this
Well,
is kind of.
Well, I just want to kind of touch on real quick, kind of the different kind of episodes, just to kind of paint a picture for people who might not be familiar.
Sure.
Which is kind of odd if they're listening and they're not familiar, but whatever. It's cool.
Welcome. How did you find us?
Yeah. Okay, so there's like very early episodes were fairly recursive structure in the sense that they're very repeating and normal, and you'll get something like Eddy will get an idea and he will try to create some scam or try to create a front, and it's usually made out of cardboard or something, and Double D would kind of be the logistics while Ed's the servant, the untrained worker.
He's the muscle.
If you will. Right. And usually there'll be something like that, or they'll try to get into something they feel excluded from. And those are kind of the normal episodes, and there's a lot of fun in that. But what's weird is when you get later into the show, you think of Ed and Eddy as something that kind of runs its formula into a ground, but there are a lot of episodes that even like kind of midway, they change up the formula a lot. Like, I don't know if you remember the episode where they're kind of
I remember them all. I defy you to name one I cannot remember.
Well, there's definitely one that really always sticks out to me as one that kind of defies the structure, when they're kind of picking at reality.
Right. They want to figure. Eddy assumes that if he learns enough, that he'll be able to then become rich, because he's rich. He knows knowledge, and so as a result, they, in trying to perform, I guess, scientific experiments, you would call it, end up actually unraveling the fabric of the show.
Well, and it's such a weird episode to me, because it like you're not sure exactly what the point is by the end of it. Like,
well, it gets very, very, in a good way, bizarre, but also very clever, incredibly clever. There's a scene where Eddy reaches behind the sun, and he's like can't figure that out. So then he grabs it and he takes a bite of the sun, and now it's a crescent moon. So he puts it back in the sky, and now it's nighttime. That's clever.
Yeah, and it's a lot of visual stuff like that that's kind of very different for the show, but that's kind of a representation of how wide-spanning the show's plots can be, even though it seems like a show that has kind of a familiar structure to it every episode. There's these episodes that kind of come out of left field and do something very strange, and so it's a show that is very odd, like especially if you compare it to Powerpuff Girls, which is very formulaic, and Dexter's Lab, which to a point is formulaic.
I'm gonna throw
This
some.
show,
I want to throw some episodes at you for
all right,
oddness, and these are ones that particularly stand out to me as being strange or not really fitting the quote-unquote mold that you
right,
picture for the show. Um, One is the Halloween special,
yes, yes,
where Ed watches too many monster movies and then envisions everyone's Halloween costumes as real. And he decides to fight them because he literally perceives them as horrible monsters that must be slain. Another one in that vein is the one where Ed thinks that he is a monster after he puts
yes.
the costume on. And it literally turns into a horror movie. I say literally in that literal sense because, well, maybe not a movie, but it turns into a horror episode because people are like going missing and it looks like they're being eaten. And they,
Yeah, it's kind of frightening as a kid, like a little kid. It's kind of like one of their episodes where they just kind of go straight horror. It's not even like parody or anything. Well, it kind of is, but it kind of goes straight like freaky for a kid.
let's see, there's the episode where at Valentine's, it's apparently the holidays is when they go crazy. The
Yeah.
Valentine's episode, which takes place in school, we'll get to that, where unexplained entirely, Jimmy and Sarah are cherubs that are randomly shooting people with arrows to make them fall in love.
Oh yeah. One episode that is possibly one of my favorites. The one where they try to make Johnny 2x4 the most annoying thing possible for some reason.
Yes. It wasn't because they would pay him to leave.
Yes. And they just keep adding things like
Let's see. Oh yeah, and they like give him bad breath, and then an ugly
and then
suit.
the block, which was oddly effective. Yeah.
Let's see. There's the one where Ed is sleepwalking.
Oh yes, that's a
And
good one.
he's eating food, and that causes him to become a gigantic beast. In a similar vein, there's one where they train Jimmy to be a sumo wrestler,
Oh yeah.
and Jimmy becomes a giant sumo wrestler.
Or the one where they have a professional wrestling league, which
Goodness.
I
People
love.
doing an imaginary wrestling league is just silly.
Yeah, just silly.
But, let's see, there's the one where the Cankers are introduced. I don't know if you remember that one. But they actually end up in their trailer, and it gets kind of creepy.
Oh yeah. I remember that. Yeah, and I don't think there's going to be an episode that I won't remember. Honestly, I think I've seen every episode
They
like
stand out.
at least 5 times. Yeah.
The one where they're trying to make a trade for an egg.
Oh yeah. And then they'll take a trope and make it really weird.
Or the one where Rolf challenges Eddy to a duel.
Oh yeah.
And they shoot it like this very dramatic action scene where he's fighting him with a log over a pit, which looks awesome, by the way.
Yeah.
I forget why Rolf was even mad at him. I just remember that scene of them fighting with fish over a pit.
But yeah, these are great examples of how weird the show can get, even though it has a set formula. But it goes out and do these weird things. And for a moment, I want to talk about like the specific characters because
Please.
again, we keep talking about how it's a strong cast, but I really want to get into it.
All right, I will do my best to remember them all.
Yeah. So there's Ed, and Eddy. Obviously, we've gone describing them. Kevin is kind of the jock, coded motorhead.
He is meant to be the kid. He's kind of meant to be the bully at first. He changes as it goes on, but his role I
Right.
always took to be as the kid who is everyone thinks he's cool, he's not that much cooler than anyone else. He just has that voice, and he's bigger
Right.
and more mature.
And his dad owns a candy factory or
Yeah,
some shit.
so everyone wants to be his friend.
Right.
But no, Kevin, I think, is actually one of the most interesting cases because at first Kevin is openly antagonistic to the point of sabotaging the plans of the Eds, whatever that may be. But as the show goes on, he actually kind of develops. If you look at the later seasons versus the earlier seasons, Kevin is still antagonistic, but usually only after he's provoked.
Yeah.
It changes to the sense of he seems less like a bully and more like he just doesn't want to put up with whatever nonsense the Eds have come up with.
It's like it to a point it feels like even though everyone knows the deal with the Eds, he's the only one that really like sees it and then rolls his eyes while everyone kind of gets into it. Like he's the one that won't go with it.
Well, and to be fair, the other kids are trying to be nice, and so it makes more.
Right.
You feel sympathy, which causes them. It should work against the Eds. You should feel like, oh, these kids are being nice to the Eds, and the Eds are taking advantage, but you never do.
Right. Well, and it's weird because we've said that the Eddies or the Ed and Eddies are kind of the bad guy, but Kevin is kind of the antagonist, if you will.
And it's all relative. It depends on where you're standing.
Right. Absolutely. But beyond Kevin, there is also Sarah, Ed's little sister, who is also kind of, in perspective allowing, is also kind of an antagonist because she is super angry, where Ed is so nice and dim-witted. She's kind of supposed to be the opposite, and it's kind of that...
well, she's a typical little sibling. She's controlling. Right. She is loud, as you mentioned. She is angry, very short-tempered, and she is also... She relishes in the fact that Ed essentially is afraid of her.
Right, absolutely.
And she acts very spoiled.
Yeah, and then there's her friend Jimmy, which there's a lot of implications behind Jimmy. One that I don't want to assume anything here or what the point was, but it always felt like he was coded gay. Like they wanted him kind of.
This is a weird conversation to have.
Well, I'm not trying to say anything by it, but I feel like to a point that was the thing they were trying to come off, or at least weak. I don't know. Like it was a weird time in the 90s.
I think the specific word you would be looking for here is that he is given traits which would be considered traditionally feminine.
Yeah.
He's very timid. He likes flowers. He likes dolls. He essentially. He always hangs out with Sarah, Ed's sister, and the way that Danny Antonucci described him was he was the kid who always wanted to play with the girl toys instead of the boy toys.
Right.
And so I agree with you that you could see an underlying sense that there are some jokes made to that effect, certainly. But I
personally mean nothing by it, but
I'm not saying you do, but I'm saying is that I do think that with Jimmy, it's meant to be specifically feminine rather than homosexual. I think that he is emulating female behavior.
Right.
Which
Fair
there
enough.
might be some overlap. I don't know, but that's another conversation.
Right. But the point I'm trying to get to is he probably has one of my favorite developments later in the show because he starts out as this innocent kid, with the braces, and he's kind of the punching bag for the show in a sense that he always kind of gets in the mess of the Ed's plan and always the one that gets injured. But then he kind of becomes super evil in the later half of the show, like secretly like. He's like his innocence is a front, and he's kind of diabolical, but that's because of a specific episode.
Oh yeah, no, it comes up again later. I forget there's an episode where he has to fight Jimmy.
Right.
And he has to fight Jimmy, and it follows up on that because Jimmy actually beats him up because he gets angry.
Right. And so that's a fun character. There's also Jimmy Two by Four, which is probably
Johnny Two
the
by Four.
oddest.
Jimmy and
Johnny,
Johnny.
sorry, yeah, slip of the tongue. But Johnny's probably one of the more interesting and out there characters that other all the other characters are probably more familiar archetypes. But he's such an odd one because he has Plank, which
Plank
is
is unto himself become such a figure in the internet culture.
yeah, he kind of ends up being a mascot for the show to a point.
So here's what's weird about that. And again, I don't know how much of this is verifiable, but this is what I heard through various interviews. Is that according to Antonucci the creator, Plank is meant to be a piece of wood and nothing else.
Right.
And
Though
then
sometimes I feel
throughout
he
the
stretches
show,
that.
the writers would slip in hints that Plank was alive and have him like do things that he would not be able to do otherwise. And that Antonucci apparently never approved of these things, that writers just enjoyed sneaking them in.
Well, I think it's weird because I think, in a sense, the show kind of walks a line between what is canon and what is just cartoon buffoonery.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense, like they'll do something and it's not canon, but it's a cartoon, so they're allowed to do it. And Plank might be one of those things where they kind of mess around with whether he's alive or not. But in canon, he's never supposed to be alive. But he does end up kind of becoming this very odd, very almost frightening figure in the show with how much they do with him. But he almost becomes more of a character than Johnny does, honestly.
Well, what's interesting about Johnny specifically is that Johnny is set up as the weird kid. He
Right.
carries around the plank of wood. He has very strange habits and mannerisms. He is always seen doing something that's kind of off kilter, and yet at the same time, he is shown as being more, I guess the word would be popular than the Eds are. He does feel like the neighborhood kids accept him more, and the only difference I can see is that Johnny is much nicer. He's much less openly antagonistic to the neighborhood kids compared to the Eds.
He's not intrusive at all. And one question though I have is that because they kind of bring it up but it's never fully addressed, is whether because they kind of reference everybody else's parents, but the question always has been for me: does Johnny have parents? Because
If
at first he had a house,
he does.
and then the Eds destroyed the house.
Yes, I
And
remember
then
that.
then he had a tree house, but he supposedly lived in the tree house, and he never referenced parents. And what parents would have a tree house replacement? So it always made me wonder.
This sounds
does
like
he
the start of a fan fiction.
maybe.
I would say the answer to that question is most likely that he has the off-screen parents, but with that said, we'll never see them. So
Like, well, it's just always because I always feel like of all of them, he has a lot more liberty in terms of what his backstory is, because like everybody else kind of has an answer, but they never really answer what's the deal with him, and so that's always been a question on my mind. But yeah, he's probably one of the more interesting figures. But then
we have
Naz, who is
He's
kind
a
of
plank of wood,
yeah,
not in the good way. I'm kidding,
No.
of course. She is desperately in need of characterization.
yeah, but
'Cause
she's there to be the attractive girl, which the jokes
attractive
they
to the
get,
characters.
yeah.
Yeah.
But the jokes they get away with her are crazy. I'm surprised that um, uh, Practice and Standards or whatever didn't put the kibosh on some of the jokes that they used, because I remember I follow an account on Twitter that's Ed and Eddy screenshots, and sometimes there'll be a screenshot of a Naz joke, and you're like, holy shit, how'd they get away with that?
Well, standards and practices don't watch cartoons. We know that.
Right, true.
But I remember another episode you just reminded me of. Another weird one is the boomerang.
Oh, Jesus, that's such an odd episode, man.
But we need to finish the rundown because we're forgetting the big one. Probably the only character in the show who could have been the star.
You're talking about Ralph, right?
Who else? Rolf. Yes.
Rolf is such a
of
good
indeterminate origin.
Rolf is much like Plank has become his own meme, and it's fantastic.
Rolf is a foreign kid, deliberately, who is shown to never. We never find out where he's from. They mention Norway, but obviously it's not.
Yeah, it's supposed to be like not per se named. It's kind of a conglomeration of different traits of being a foreign immigrant, but I
But
never feel like it's hurtful or demeaning in any way. He's very he's actually an upstanding character if you look at him.
no, he is, and not only that, but because he is of indeterminate origin, that gives them a lot of leeway to make all of these various weird foreigner jokes
Yeah,
about how he
without
has these
offending anyone
strange,
specific.
nonsensical customs. He apparently his parents live on a farm, but they're in a suburban neighborhood. So
Right. It's kind of a
it
weird
never
odd.
makes any sense because he has like livestock and like a tractor.
Well, hold on, because I know there's the cul-de-sac, but I'm not because I'm trying to remember the layout. Because if I remember right, his house is a little bit off from the. It's still suburbia, no doubt, but it's a little bit off from the cul-de-sac. Like they have to go a little ways. Though who knows, the construction or the structure of that place could change, and it's a cartoon, right? But
If it's a joke, I find is usually the case. But
right,
the thing
but
is,
he's a great character though.
so I like to kind of. We're going to come back to the next one because the only people we haven't talked about are the sisters, but we'll come back to them.
Right.
Because I do want to talk for a moment and say that what's interesting about the humor is that the humor is simultaneously grounded and completely nonsensical, depending on what scene it is.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of the show in a nutshell, in an odd way, because the concept is very grounded, but everything about it can be nonsensical. Like in comparison to the other Cartoon Network shows, as we keep doing, they're just kids. Like that's the whole point, but it
Mm-hmm.
gets so ridiculous, and so yeah, the humor is a great reflection of that. And
Because I'll give you an example. This is just off the top of my head. This isn't from an episode, but it would not be uncommon for the Eds to be sitting on a curb, and then Ed will like wander off, and they'll be talking about how they need to do something, and in the background, Ed will just with one hand pick up a house and be looking underneath of it, and
yeah,
then drop
yeah,
it, and then they'll walk over and pick up a tree, like without any effort.
right,
And
and yeah,
it's not. It's such a weird tone, and when I think the reason I mentioned this is because we do talk about how with someone like Rolf, it gets so bizarre. There's the hat. There's a giant hammer hat has become a thing.
yeah,
Um, there is a. He's got this shed full of potatoes, and there's a scene where Double D figures out how to make them work, where they build a machine in the shed that peels the potatoes and then launches them into a tennis racket that Eddie's holding to make French fries. And you see what I mean in that it's like it starts out very grounded and realistic to becoming, heaven forbid, a cartoon.
Right. Well, in the humor itself varies so often. Like there's slapstick, but then there's kind of humorous dialogue. Then there's absurdity, and then there's kind of mature hidden humor. It kind of like where other shows kind of have a direction. This show spreads out and puts its finger in every pie.
Well, and that kind of speaks to the idea also that they are children.
Yeah,
And that it's never clear how much of this is actually happening versus their imagination. Some of the things are
absolutely.
very obviously exaggerated, but at the same time, there's still that fourth wall meta humor where it's very much a cartoon show. They're referencing episodes and time limits and standards and practices.
Right.
So it exists in this weird niche where there's almost this fluctuating tone throughout the episodes. But I do
Right.
want to
And
move on to because there is a structure. The structure is that this is all happening because it is the summertime,
absolutely right.
and the summertime is it was for the first, I believe it was the first 5 seasons if I'm not mistaken. I think there was it's either 4 seasons then 5 and then 6 is the movie, or five,
Right.
six, 7. But the point is,
Something like that.
the final season before they went on temporary hiatus and then later made the movie was summer comes to an end and they go back to school. And for a lot of people, they do feel like this is where the quality kind of dropped a little bit. I
I'm not sure if
disagree,
I
but
agree. Yeah.
a lot of people felt that it did feel like they lost something in this shift to the school. That was they lost this feeling of timelessness. They lost this feeling of being a kid on summer vacation that the show had relied on for so long. And I don't know if that's true because it is certainly an interesting change, but I do admire them trying to do something like that to essentially uproot the formula.
Well, and if I could comment, I think when they finally do this, there is a shift in the show, but I feel it's not a quality drop. I think it's very much a tone change that people were not expecting because the show itself uh, suddenly stops being so hallucinatory, if that makes sense, and starts kind of getting a little bit more grounded. But it's like kids in school, like kids not wanting to be in school. It kind of takes what we know of Edda and Eddy in terms of concept, and it puts them back at school just for like a season or so,
Well, and
just to see.
one thing that does go away for sure in the final season is the scams.
Right,
Those
right.
are just they're taken out of the show entirely. Instead, the plots revolve around, for example, Eddie wants to figure out how to get out of school, and so they make it a parody of a prison movie.
Right. Well, I think in a sense the scams don't exactly go away. They're just less about money and jawbreakers, which we went this whole time without saying jawbreakers, which I feel is a sin. But they're
Actually, that's
it
appropriate if you think about it.
true. But the scams shift to school related, whether it be homework or whether it be tests or whether it be getting out of school or something like that. It becomes a different mindset. Like he's still doing these schemes, if you will, but it's more about school, which I think makes sense when you talk about the dynamic of summer versus the dynamic of going back to school.
Well, and
It's still there.
I do wonder if there was in response to the, I guess the word would be criticism, that the Eds are antagonistic towards the other kids. So they said, okay, so we'll shift it to them instead being in a school setting, and now they are actively they're participating in the same hijinks. They're shenaniganing, if you will, but they are doing it in school. It's not about taking money from people. It's about we want to get out of class early, or it's about, oh, there's a school dance coming up and we need to find dates.
Right. It stops being about them being against the other kids and more just about them interacting with their setting specifically.
Right, and like I said, I don't disagree that I disagree with the idea that the quality became bad necessarily. Although
No,
I
I
do
think
understand the idea that it really does it throws a curveball in the formula.
right. The show does take a change and a significant change in structure. As I mentioned, there's less of that wacky cartoon buffoonery. There's still some of it, but it's a lot more controlled versus where you were talking about Ed picking up a house and tree. There's not so much of uh, that crazy, just random uh, uh, cartoon absurdity, and it kind of, and I think in that sense, the tone shift of going to school, it's appropriate when you think about how would we do Ed's go to school. I think it works
One
in that
thing that
sense.
one thing that does not work, by the way, not to kind of bridge off what you said, one thing that does not work about that final season is the way that they keep the main cast intact, but the trade-off is that they're in a school. So it always came across as very strange that there would be these kids there, but the schools always looked abandoned.
Right.
There's
Well,
no
they always.
teacher, there's no other kids. It does feel kind of limiting in a
Well,
way.
I think a problem becomes that they suddenly have this because in summer it kind of has that feeling of no adults, no rules, and such, and anyone can interact with anyone, so anyone can come up in an episode. Where when they go to school, they have to work around there being adults. So there's adults there, but they're not there. Like Kevin will have talked to the gym teacher, but you won't see him in class or anything. And all the kids have the same classes for some reason.
Well, there's a football game at one point, and they have a football game, and when you look in the stands, it's empty except for the 7 or 8 main cast members.
Right.
Because the Eds are on the field, and there's apparently another team, but you don't really see the other team.
Right, and that'll bring me into another subject. But I'm not sure if you want to talk about that now. Is the fan theory of purgatory?
Let's put a pin in that because I do want to
Yeah.
talk about it, but I do want to mention for the last season. I just kind of want to say, I appreciate that they're going for a shift. I do like that. I admire that creatively that they're going
Absolutely.
to step away from that, but I do think they kind of didn't fully commit to the idea. And what I mean by that is that okay, so we're changing the setting. They're going to school, but we're not introducing teachers. We're not introducing any new characters. We're going to keep it the same formula, just in a different place. And I do think that does harm the season in comparison to the other ones because they transplant it rather than adapting to the new environment. I do wonder if people would have liked it better if they had maybe expanded the cast. I'm not suggesting 25 new people to make it a realistic school,
Right.
but like add in at least one other character because
So,
it comes across as all very much like the school is abandoned, or
right.
or why does this need to be here?
So I think to your point that even though like it feels that putting it into a school was trying to refresh the show a little, you think that they dropped some opportunities to really kind of reinvent the show a little.
I think that the reason that it does suffer in comparison to the episodes in the cul-de-sac is because they didn't differentiate it enough from the cul-de-sac. If you're going to have a complete and total change of setting, that's fine. But to say, well, we're just going to do the exact same formula as before in a different place, I don't know. It seems like there should have been a more of a shift in just the structure.
Right.
The tone can stay the same. The tone is fine. It's the structure I think is really where they do miss some opportunities.
Well, and something I want to talk about that is kind of goes over that a bit is, do you remember how the show originally ends?
Oh yes, I do. The show originally ends, and this isn't actually. This is at the end of the first season because there were 15 episodes, and it's revealed that the entire show, spoilers I suppose, has been
Right.
a dream of the 80-year-old Eds, and they've all just been remembering what their childhoods were like, which, by the way, also explains all of the wackiness and shenanigans.
Right, absolutely. And there that is again. But
You're fine.
yeah, I feel to a point like they originally wanted to end on that note, but the fans probably reacted very poorly because there is an episode in the last season. I think it might be the last episode of the show where they actually end it on a everyone kind of wins note, and Eddy kind of talks to the audience and says, "Is everybody happy now?"
It's well, that could just be Eddie. What happens is I remember this episode is it's because he's gonna get in a fight with Jimmy for some reason, and then
Right.
Jimmy ends up getting upset because Eddie is hitting him, and then he beats up Eddie, and Jimmy is carried away as a conquering hero, and then Eddie gives all of the Eds hot dogs, and they're eating hot dogs, and they're happy, and he's like, "There you go, everyone happy, good."
Right.
And with that said, of course, that isn't the real ending. There are technically 3 endings to the show,
Right.
uh, which we're going to do so we're going to talk about the last characters, and then we're going to move into the finale. The last
Right.
characters that we've not mentioned so far, partially because they're some of the most polarizing characters in the show, are the Canker sisters.
Yes, and
And if we were going to talk about antagonistic forces, this is them.
yeah, these are probably the official quote unquote bad guys of the show. Because even if you want to consider the Ed boys like not good guys, these people kind of represent bad guys because they kind of they mess with everybody. They don't just mess with the Eds, they mess with everybody. When they show up, no one wants them there for the most part, and then they ruin the Eds plan. They are always if they look like they're about to succeed, the Canker sisters come in as a sort of anti Deus Ex Machina and kind of
No, it's a
ruin
Deus
everything.
Ex Machina, but it's not for the Eds.
Right, fair
um,
enough.
and the Canker sisters, of course, are the three sisters who live in a trailer park outside of the cul-de-sac, who have crushes on the Eds, respectively, and who actively interfere in whatever the Eds are doing at any given time.
Yeah,
And
and one thing I want to know, this is one of those things that like always seemed like kind of one of those snarky commentary-esque things, not really commentary, but kind of a pessimistic uh, adult worldview of when you look at the Kanker sisters, you think about the trailer park. Because I when I was younger, I grew up in a trailer park, not necessarily that great trailer park, but trailer park, and they always have that connotation of being very run down and whatnot. And so there's the fact that the Kanker sisters are sisters, but they look three different ways. And so take that as you will. I think like in the first episode they introduce them. They have like three different dads, which as a kid you don't think about, but as an adult watching that, you're like, hold up, wait a minute.
well, and depending on you can view this two different ways. You can view the Cankers either as um, very much characters who exist solely to provide an antagonistic force to the plot, and
Right.
who oftentimes through plot convenience will have a way to foil the Eds at the last moment, which makes them very frustrating for a lot of people. But at the same time, you do mention there's also an inherent tragedy to these characters. They live in a trailer park. They are poor. They don't have anything except each other. But
Right.
and they most likely come from a broken home. That's very heavily implied. So it's interesting because with the Canker sisters, and again, they're polarizing. You usually either love them or hate them. They have this role as they exist within the plot to foil whatever the Eds are coming up with. And that can come across as frustrating, especially across multiple episodes. But at the same time, you can't help but feel a little bit sorry or sympathetic for their background.
Yeah, and so if I can frame this a second, because I think I love doing this where you take something that it has initial framing as just watching it in a show like Canker Sisters are antagonistic, but let's put all the details together that we're getting to. That in a sense, they broken homes, they don't really have a father figure per se, but then they get attracted to the Ed boys. They see the Ed boys, and they're infatuated with them, and suddenly they're in every ordeal that the Ed boys are coming up with, and they're not. It's not necessarily that they're trying to ruin it. They're trying to be a part of it. They want to be a part of this thing of the guys they like.
I
And
think
so
that
to Go ahead.
sometimes they're trying to ruin it. Sometimes
Right,
they'll actively like break the mechanism or something.
right,
But I know what you mean. There is this sense that they like the Eds. They don't want the Eds to be. They think the Eds should be hanging out with them and be their boyfriends. Ironically, if we want to get really weird with it, we could say that's how they saw their mother most likely going after these men.
Oh,
And
geez, I didn't even think about that.
but and so I don't see it necessarily that they want to be part of the Eds thing so much as they think the Eds should be paying attention to them rather
Right,
than whatever scheme they're concocting. And
right,
it's almost as if they don't understand, like literally don't understand, that the Eds do not like them that way.
right. And with this, and maybe I'm jumping ahead just a little bit. Do you want to talk about? I guess I'll refer to it as the subject at hand.
Um, okay, so I'll introduce it, then you can speak on it.
All right.
So of the Kanker sisters, by far, by far the most popular among all the fans I've ever talked to is Marie. Marie is the middle sister, I believe, and she has blue hair and
Has that punk rock aesthetic.
kind of as like middle school punk rock.
Yeah.
But she likes Double D, and there are a lot of people who are on board with the idea. They like the pairing, if you will, of Marie and Double D. And I will turn this to you because honestly, I don't get it, but I will give my response. Go ahead. I'll let you speak. I'll let you speak your piece.
This almost turns into a debate, and this is a debate we've had a few times. That okay, so there's this the infatuation of the Double D and Marie Kanker pairing, or the shipping as it is, and let me tell you, there is a lot of fan art. I actually have some of it in a folder because I'm very much a supporter of this pairing, and
Things you should not admit on camera. Talk with Clark after. No, keep going.
And the thing is, why I enjoy it so much is that there's a few things to it. Oddly, or honestly, there's that aspect that's very common, especially with nerd guys being interested in the goth girl, and at least where I grew up, this is a very common thing. Like, and maybe not just nerd guys, but I've noticed it with my nerd friends and whatnot. It's a very and maybe it's more goth than it is the nerd aspect, but it's something that is very a big infatuation with guys, especially nerds, because goth or punk girls or whatever kind of represent that fuck the system mentality, kind of crazy and whatnot, and everything you can imply there. But there's also this kind of contrast, which is very interesting to me. I always found it very interesting how opposite Double D and Marie are. And Marie, despite her outlawish tendencies, her kind of punk rock anarchy aesthetic, she's into this guy who is very regiment oriented, who has everything organized, and there's something she sees in that. And I think if I were to take this beyond just being the cartoon it is, which it's very superficial in every sense, but if I were to take it and actually overanalyze it, which is our whole point, there's a thing I like to think about, that these two in their opposites kind of fulfill something for each other, where Marie, with her, you've taken the trailer park, the being poor, the broken family, so on and so forth. She sees Double D, and there's order there. There's something that puts itself together. There's something that she can almost count on. There's something that she
I
can.
feel like this is given some thought.
More thought than you want to believe, man. But she sees something there that she doesn't have in her life. Something that's it's organized. She can rely upon it. It's consistent. She sees it, and it won't disappear. And where Double D, and he doesn't see it, it's not his perspective per se, but it's something that, because Double D, as you, if it was a real person, is way too over regimented. There's too much organization. There's the whole funny, sad thing about his parents and the sticky note, which is a meme, but we already have so many fan theories going that I won't get into that per se. But he obviously needs something to break that mold, because it does become a character problem in a lot of episodes where he has to be OCD. It interferes with his life, and so to me, Marie kind of breaks that. And so when you think of it even beyond a cartoon show, those characters, in a sense, in my personal opinion, interlock with what they need from each other, and so that's why I am such a fan of that pairing. And not only that, it's the fan art's adorable. I look up the fan art and I'm like, yes, this is perfect.
He is, of course, referring to fan art that is absolutely and totally submittable and safe for work.
Yeah.
Not moving on.
Yeah.
I will say. That was so in depth. I even don't want to say anything except to say that I have a slight disagreement in that within the canon of the show, Marie is not sufficiently developed as a character to suggest whether or not she would be an ideal pairing. That's all I'll say on that front.
All
Because
right.
there is a lot of inference going on that I
Right.
don't
Fair enough.
necessarily disagree with. It's just that within the canon of the show, I do not know if that's developed enough to make a call on.
Maybe it's that it's matured and developed in my head.
Whatever works, man. But I do want to wrap up because there is one thing we want to talk about, and that is, of course, that after that season, that last season. Um,
Well, first thing is that we'll talk about that, but then I have
mhm,
just one question at the end, and we'll get that at the end. Just
sure,
keep that in mind.
sure. And after that, we will go. Before that, rather, we're going to talk about because after that, there's a hiatus, and Danny Antonucci is working on a movie. It's in production hell for a little while, and they're not sure if it's going to be in theaters or on Cartoon Network. But after a couple years, it does finally debut, and that is the series finale of the show, as it were. It's an hour and a half, give or take, with commercials movie special. That's basically a three-part episode, and it really does do a lot in terms of no real spoilers here because I do think everyone should kind of watch it, but it does a lot in terms of finalizing a lot of the aspects of the show. It closes a lot of loose ends.
I even think it makes, again, trying not to do any too many spoilers. It makes Eddy, the person who is has been consistently the kind of the dirt bag of the show, no matter what, he's still kind of a douche to say. It kind of this kind of gives him an angle of sympathy.
Well, and to me, I honestly do believe that throughout the show's run, Eddy has always been the quote unquote protagonist of the show. I feel like as much as Double D and Ed are entertaining and consistent and part of it, it very much is Eddy in the driver's seat, if you will. It
Right.
really is him who gets the most focus in terms of driving the plot forward. And I feel like, in a way, this really is Eddy's story most of all that comes to a fitting conclusion. Again, I don't want to spoil it, but the movie does it puts a great cap on the show as a whole, and it does wrap up everything neatly that you would could hope to be wrapped up, with
And it
one
does.
intentional with one intentional exception.
Right. Well, and it does actually a very good job of being canonical
Yeah.
in the things it references. Like, oddly, Ed, and Eddy has small bits of canon that continue throughout the show, but this is one big point. I'll put this out there because I kind of want to talk about it a little. Is Eddie's brother? He's a
Mm-hmm.
big point of it, but he is referenced earlier, but you never see him because he's supposed to be quote unquote one of those adult figures. But he kind of comes in and he's this adult that you see, and what he represents is kind of it's the whole point of the movie for the most part, even though you spend most of the time not seeing him still until the very end. But what he represents for Eddy and everything else kind of makes you think back to all the other episodes and what he was trying to emulate and understand, and you kind of feel like it wasn't his fault.
Well, it does a good job in building up sympathy that was it honestly it's almost retroactive. The
Right.
throughout the movie you really do feel more than you have for the entire series. Up until the movie, the sympathy for the Eds has come because they're likable, they're friendly, they're funny. They are going around shenaniganing as cartoon characters, and you feel sorry for them because they never succeed, even though they are ostensibly failing at acts that are selfish or otherwise. I don't want to say evil, that's way too strong of a word, but you get the
Right.
idea.
Yeah.
But the movie really does go out of its way to, I hate to use this word, but it's true, humanize the three main characters, Eddy the most, to really, really explain why they are the way they are. And that's what I think is the real strength, is because up until that film, you've kind of just accepted the Eds in the same way you'd accept Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck. You don't need to know where he was born. You just know that he's a rabbit. You don't need to know what the Eds in particular are So you don't need to know about really anything except their basic personality traits. And yet, here comes the movie. Suddenly, now you are learning, oh, this is the reason, this is how they got this way. It wasn't, they didn't just pop into being. There's a backstory here. The movie does go in a way to not only set that up, but it does, in a way, change the way you view the rest of the show on subsequent viewings, now that some of the things in the movie are canonized.
Right, and I'm not sure how much of a thing it was going to be, but there was a rumor that they were going to do the movie, and then they were going to try to do one more season. But as we've seen, that didn't happen, and so I'm not sure how sure that was a
I
thing
don't
or
think
if
it
that
would
was
have
just
worked.
something.
I
No,
was
I don't
gonna
think
say,
so
I don't think
either.
so, because the movie is such a good job of okay, the end, that to then turn around and try and say, okay, now we're going back to the formula previously. Well, the formula's been broken.
Right,
The movie, as much as I ragged on the fifth season for sticking too strictly to the formula, the movie buries it. The movie says that formula is now done. The Again, with as few spoilers as possible, after the events of the movie, the show could not continue with the formula that was making up the first four seasons.
right.
It
I
would be
completely agree.
it's a different, it would be a different show basically. So I don't know if a seventh season would have worked or if they would have had to undo the movie, which I would not have done.
Yeah, it's probably the best option that they didn't do an additional season, even though it was rumored.
Yeah, I mean I love the show, I do, but I would have watched the seventh season. It would have been fine, but it would kind of feel like, well, it's going against. It would be kind of like how in SpongeBob, the movie is always the ending, even if there's more stuff afterward.
Right. And maybe the seventh season or whatever was only like, oh, someone said it in passing, and then everyone took it to be like gospel or whatever. But yeah, I definitely think it was best that the movie itself was the ending to the show.
All right, we are going to wind down now. I do want to hear your question, but I want to first say final thoughts, just in terms of why do you think the series has managed to stay in your head for so long, and what would you tell people who may be interested in watching it?
As for me, why the show has stuck with me so well is one, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, it's very relatable in the sense that when you're a kid, you feel small and helpless to an extent, and so the Ed boys, even though they're not exactly justified in a sense, you still feel relatable to them because, in a sense, as a kid, you feel like you're not succeeding, or at least that's how I always felt. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if I had a plan or whatever, because I'm a little kid or whatever, it wouldn't come to fruition to an extent. And on top of that, beyond that, it always had the most interesting sense of humor and the most interesting characters, and maybe it wasn't the most perfectly written show or whatever, but it threw so much against the wall that it stuck out to me as the most unique. And I think, if anything, my nostalgia for it will always override. Like, this is how, like, I've looked at cartoon shows from my childhood and rewatched them, and I'm like, not nearly as fun. But for some reason, the nostalgia of this show is so strong that it will always override my critical ability to ever like critically analyze it, and I'll just always enjoy it. So I think it's forever preserved in my mind like that.
I would agree. I would say that, and to kind of bridge off that, I do think the show, in a lot of ways, did things that cartoon sense it is. They do it, but the humor felt very meta and experimental, and yet at the same time, it would not be out of place in a Looney Tunes cartoon. It wouldn't be out of place in Tom and Jerry.
Right.
It's all over the map, and yet at the same time, that's in a good way. It's in a good way because not only does it go everywhere, it holds nothing back, but at the same time, the characters are so strong, they are so memorable. It's it really works on developing them throughout the series to the point where there's no one I actively dislike, even though I joke about Naz being a plank of wood. I
Right.
remember her. And
Yeah.
I do think that as an ensemble cast, the show it works to it pulls it off in a way that other cartoons aren't quite able to replicate. And it does so while still being very funny, while still being very clever, while still being meta and wild and chaotic, and yet at the same time grounded and relatable. And
Absolutely.
so, just everything about it, I recommend it watching because it does stick with you. Everything that is done here, you can tell, is done with love. It is done to be, I don't want to say appealing like marketing sense, but it's done in a way where it's meant to be relatable. It is
Yeah.
meant to be something that anyone can recognize and just watch and feel like it's something that they have experienced themselves. Or some
Unique but
it's
familiar.
exactly, and that on top of very good writing and
Yeah.
just everything I mentioned. So all right, so with that, I do want to know what is this question you've been saving?
Okay, so this has been a question for a long time for Ed and Eddie fans, and for the most part, I think people have kind of come to a consensus. But I want to hear your opinion. Um, what's underneath Double D's hat?
Oh man. Okay. Three theories here.
All right.
I'm gonna give you three theories. I'll tell you which you decide which one has the most credence.
All right.
The first theory is that it is some kind, and these are not all mine. These are the ones I've heard,
Right.
and these are the ones I give the most credence to. The first is that it is some kind of wound or scar, especially one relating to quote the dodgeball incident,
Right.
because Double D is there's a scene where they're going to throw a dodgeball at him and he falls down on his hands and knees and is cowering. And the idea is that whatever the dodgeball incident was, it gave him a scar, and that's why he wears the hat. I don't agree with this one because he was clearly wearing it as a child in the flashback.
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be the dodgeball incident, but
No, that's true.
Scar wouldn't
But
be so unbelievable.
let's see. Number two is that it's just a fashion sense. And in the sense that Double D is, how do I explain it? If we're going off the idea that he is not like clinically, but he's OCD, it's an extension of that. In the same way that he has to scrub everything, he has to have the hat. It's less about what's underneath it and more that he as a person refuses to remove it. And that Ed and Eddy, whenever they do see him without the hat, they're more reacting in shock that they're seeing him without it than what is particularly under it. That it's like Linus's blanket.
Right.
That's the second theory. And the third theory, of course, is that it's something outlandish with the sense. It's a third eye, which there's precedent for.
Really?
You don't know about this?
This is the first time I've heard the theory.
No, this is not a theory. That if you look at, there's a scene in the show where Lee's hair flies up and she has three eyes.
All right. Well, I remember Lee's.
And a double D is something similar. That is a mutation of some kind.
Okay.
And so this theory is that just like Lee has three eyes, which may or may not be canon depending on who you ask, Double D has a third eye underneath of it, or some kind of similar mutation that is the result of possibly something in the water. Whatever caused that in Lee caused the same thing in Double D, and so he wears a hat.
Okay. So, and I can see all theories, but the one I personally go with is the scar.
Mm-hmm.
For specific reasons. You mentioned that he has nothing, that the possibility he has nothing under, and it's an OCD thing, but you also mentioned Ed's and Eddie's reaction. But the thing is, there's that episode where he's wearing pantyhose on his head because he can't find his actual hat, and they tied his the pantyhose to the fan or whatever, but it pops off. But the
So that was
reaction
his hat, but yeah.
was it? I thought it was
No, there was an episode where he does it. It's because he can't get his hat off the fan. He's wearing the pantyhose later.
Oh, right. Yeah, I mixed it up. Um, but the reaction is not so much. It's like cool, like they saw something. I wouldn't say it's like, oh wow, we got him without his hat, but I feel like they saw something. And to me, the thing is like, okay, so the third eye wouldn't be totally out there, but something it would have to be something that Double D is embarrassed by, and a scar that kind of messes with his kind of his symmetry in a sense, and something that other people would find cool, but like Double D is, he does not find the same interest other people would, and he kind of finds it embarrassing. And so I've always kind of dedicated myself to that theory. Like there's been a whole bunch of theories, but to me the scar one has always been the one that had the most credence.
No, he would have had to have it when he was little because he's wearing the hat back then too, assuming that is quote unquote canon. But
Right, but and I still think it's possible. Again, it wouldn't be the dodgeball incident.
well,
But
that's one of the fans who was just putting as much as they could into the theory. But
oh yeah, there's one. There's we wanted to talk about that, and we'll keep this quick. What are
for the
your
record,
opinions?
I don't subscribe to whatever you're about to say.
With the so you don't subscribe to you don't. What's your opinion on the purgatory theory?
Um, my response to that would be the same as the problem I had with the Marie at Double D pairing, in that there is not enough evidence in the show to make the leaps that the theory does. For people who have no idea what the hell we're talking about, there is a fan theory circulating that the cul-de-sac is purgatory and that the characters contained therein are all various people from the different time periods. Like Rolf is a farmer because he's from the 20s, or Double D is from the 80s when parents were more protective. I forget the whole thing. But my problem with that theory is that two things. Number one, the characters acknowledge it's a show.
Right.
And number two is that in the show, there is not enough evidence without major inference as to a lot of the things that the theory posits.
I get what you're saying, and to me, like the theory, like
It's
okay,
interesting.
so yeah, and it's more one of those things that fans do, like oh, the possibility is there, and that's fair, and it's not to say that it's actually canon or anything. Like the fans are thinking that's the idea
I think
behind it.
Antonucci actually denied it.
What?
I think Antonucci might have denied it at some point. He said that's not true.
That's a possibility, but to a point, I don't think people are like trying to believe it's canon, but it's something that they think, oh, the possibility there, and it's fun. But my problem when it comes to fan theories like that is that difficulty where there's a lot of fan theories that are about, oh, what is and what isn't, and then there's fan theories of, well, what's fun, and some people take the fun out of it. Like they make it like this. They have to have that continuation of the fan theory, like everything. Like you know how people. The joke is that when a new season of something comes out and it's like, oh, this ruined my fan fiction. I feel like people have a problem with that, like with fan theory, that when it comes out, it has to be like scripture and
Well,
whatnot.
like I said, it's interesting. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's
But
fun.
if you go by the evidence in the show, I think that the most likely, all that's canon is that it most likely the characters do realize they're in a TV show. Even though
Right.
the movie seems to contradict that, but still.
Right.
Um,
Anyways, we should probably wrap up.
Yes, so watch Ed, and Eddy if you have the chance. If you ever see it on the late night TV, Boomerang, or wherever it's airing, you won't be disappointed if you've never seen it. Or if you have seen it, you will be surprised at just how good it is if you haven't seen it in a while, because it does hold up.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen it, or haven't seen the movie, but you've seen the show, definitely look for the movie. It's definitely worth the watch. If you were a big Ed and Eddy fan, it definitely holds up and brings fanfare to the conclusion. But that is it for this episode of Pedanticast.
Do we know what we're talking about next time yet?
No, but I have a list of things and I can go over that with you. But we will have a subject next time, and probably. I'll probably announce that on Twitter if you follow me at
Follow him. I don't have one.
actually I'll put my Twitter link in the description, but Thank you for watching Pedanticast. We have an episode every Monday, and every other week we have
That's the
our.
goal.
Yeah, that's the goal. Hopefully, we keep consistent with that. But every other week, we will hopefully have our Do You Even Anime series where we challenge each other to watch an anime we haven't seen before, see how far we can get
I recommend
through it,
watching
and then
that when
talk
Gable
about it.
is going to have to watch a show about maids.
Yeah, it will be a trip, and so either we're torturing each other or we're actually going to make real recommendations at some point. But again, thank you for watching Pedanticast. Hopefully, we'll see you next week.
I feel like we need a naked outlet.
A what?
A naked outlet
A naked outlet?
for all these shameless plugs. See you next
Yeah.
time, guys.
Oh man.